Now before I go on to the hats, I think there's somebody you should know, and that is Viktor Vasnetsov. Now he is credited with sort of bringing back old Russian myths and installing a new sense of nationalism within Russia, and he's responsible for a lot of the famous images, like the famous one of Ivan the Terrible you've probably seen that was done by him. But because of his fame, he was allegedly hired during World War I to design new Russian uniform. Now because he was into romanticism, he styled the new hats based on the old helmets of the Kievan Rus, i.e. just pointed. But the Tsar was toppled before these hats could be used by the Russian Imperial Army, so the first people to take up the new design were the Bolsheviks, in particular the cavalry. Now I should say at this point that the Red Army very rarely wore matching uniforms, but this hat was preferred by a lot of people. Now you may be asking, why didn't they just wear helmets? And there's a couple of reasons for this. First of all, limited resources is of course one reason, but the Russians during World War I wore the French Adrian helmet, and for most reports I've read, this turned out to be a very poor helmet, because the badge at the front had, well, they needed two holes at the front of the helmet to put the badge in, and these two holes made the helmet incredibly weak and bullets could penetrate it. So the soldiers often just ditched the helmet and wore fur hats, or at least cloth hats instead. So this hat, this pointed hat, sort of became the hat of the Red Army and a symbol of Bolshevism in a way. The White Army, on the other hand, wore the Ushanka. Now this is the hat you would probably call the Russian hat today, and it too was designed during the Civil War, allegedly by a White Army general named Alexander Kolchak. Well, that's one theory. Anyway, now there were of course fur hats like this worn previously, but the design with like the circular top and ear flaps and stuff like that was designed during the Civil War. Of course the White Army lost the war and the Ushanka fell out of favour in Russia for around 2 decades, but Russian emigres helped export the hat abroad and it was taken on by other armies, notably the Finnish army. And it was during the Winter War between Finland and the Soviet Union that the Soviets began to realise that it was the far better hat. The Finnish troops wore it and the Soviets did not, and a lot of Soviet troops died of exposure. So the Soviets, suffering defeat, partially due to the deaths caused by exposure, decided to take on the Ushanka despite its old connotations with being associated with the White Army. And from there they issued it to their own army and it became a symbol of Russia, essentially. And of course from Russia it spread outwards and was a pretty important hat during the Chinese Civil War, for instance.